Hello and welcome to Indus News Live from Islamabad. I'm Hira Mustafa and these are the headlines. The US says it will not undertake a hasty pullout of troops from Afghanistan that puts NATO forces at risk. Addressing a news conference at Pentagon, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said more progress is needed in Afghan peace talks before Western forces withdrawal. He urged all parties to decrease violence and choose the path towards peace. Meanwhile, 3 people have been killed and 2 others wounded in 2 explosions that rocked Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. Police say a woman is among those killed in the attacks. Magnetic IED blast attacks have alarmingly increased in Kabul in recent months. The US says it will not bow to Iran's pressure before talks in returning to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. In a statement, White House said Washington does not need to take additional administrative steps to participate in revival talks. Meanwhile, diplomats said the UN nuclear watchdog has found uranium particles at 2 Iranian sites it inspected after months of stonewalling. Brazil has registered over 1,300 more COVID-19 deaths, with the death toll crossing 244,000. Meanwhile, the U.S. said its land borders with Canada and Mexico will remain closed until March 21st to control the pandemic spread. Pakistan has registered over 1,300 new cases and 36 deaths overnight, taking the toll to 12,563. Globally, the virus has claimed over 2.4 million lives and infected more than 110 million people so far. Well, these were the headlines. News in detail coming after the short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now the news in detail. The U.S. says it will not undertake a hasty pullout of troops from Afghanistan that puts NATO forces at risk. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says more progress is needed in Afghan peace talks before Western forces withdrawal. Addressing a news conference at Pentagon, Austin said the U.S. is mindful of the looming deadlines but wants to do this methodically and deliberately. He added Washington is committed to a responsible and sustainable end to the Afghan war.
I urge all parties to choose the path towards peace, and the violence must decrease now. I told our allies that no matter what the outcome of our review, the United States will not undertake a hasty or disorderly withdrawal from Afghanistan that puts their forces or the alliance's reputation at risk. At this time, no decisions about our future force posture have been made.
This comes a day after Austin discussed Afghanistan with NATO defense ministers in Brussels. And now moving on, Pakistan says the U.S. must consult the Taliban on any extension of a May 1st deadline for a full troop pullout from Afghanistan. Addressing a think tank, Islamabad's envoy to Washington, Asad Majid Khan cautioned the U.S. against a unilateral decision on the matter. Khan said the U.S. should be talking to all stakeholders in Afghanistan rather than telling them what to do. He added instead of opening or reopening what has been already achieved, it is important to focus on the intra-Afghan talks. This comes a day after NATO said the alliance will not leave Afghanistan unless they believe the time and situation is right. 3 people have been killed and 2 others wounded in 2 explosions that rocked Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. Police say a woman is among those killed in the attacks. Police say the first explosion targeted a civilian vehicle in the west of Kabul, in which 2 people were wounded. They said the second explosion happened in the Karte Parvan area of the capital, in which 3 people However, no group has claimed responsibility for the attack so far. Magnetic IED blast attacks have alarmingly increased in Kabul in recent months. The U.S. says it will not bow to Iran's pressure before talks on returning to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. White House says Washington does not need to take additional administrative steps to participate in revival talks. Talking to reporters, White House spokesperson Jen Psaki said the EU has invited the U.S. for talks over the JCPOA. But she added it is simply an invitation to have a diplomatic conversation. Psaki said the U.S. has no plan to withdraw so-called snapback sanctions against Iran. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Iran is much closer to being able to produce a nuclear weapon. In an interview, he said the policy of so-called maximum pressure of previous U.S. administration against Iran has not produced results. Meanwhile, diplomats said the UN nuclear watchdog has found uranium particles at 2 Iranian sites it inspected after months of stonewalling. They said the watchdog is preparing to rebuke Tehran for failing to explain this to the agency. The U.S. has condemned the use of force against peaceful protesters in Myanmar, urging the military to refrain from violence. Yesterday, a young woman became the first protester to die in the anti-coup demonstrations in Myanmar. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said the U.S. is saddened by reports of protesters' death. The army says one policeman has also died of injuries sustained in a protest. Meanwhile, members of Myanmar ethnic groups staged a protest in a show of opposition to the coup. The protesters have been demanding the restoration of the elected government and the release of all detainees. They have called for the scrapping of a 2008 constitution that was drawn up under army supervision and gives it a decisive role in politics. Meanwhile, the internet remained suspended in the country for the 6th consecutive night. U.S. President Joe Biden says America is officially back as a world ally and ready to engage with its friends. In his virtual address to the Munich Security Conference, Biden said the U.S. will work with EU partners to counter shared challenges. This report has more. Biden marks his debut on the global stage as president with a promise to reorient the U.S. away from Donald Trump's America First policy. At the center of this was his commitment to multilateral organizations and key U.S. allies. Biden said the U.S. will work with the EU to counter shared obstacles and added that Washington is fully committed to NATO. Biden said the U.S. commitment to the NATO alliance is unshakable and promised to observe the principle that an attack on one member is an attack on all. He also pointed out challenges posed by Russia, Iran, and China. Biden said Moscow has tried to destabilize democracy in the U.S. and called for unity to counter what he called China's abusive economic practices. On the challenge posed by Iran, he said the U.S. will re-engage in diplomacy amid efforts to revive the nuclear deal. Biden pledged $4 billion for global vaccination efforts and announced Washington's re-entry into the Paris Climate Accord. Brazil has registered over 1,300 more COVID-19 deaths, with its toll crossing 244,000. The U.S. says its land borders with Canada and Mexico will remain closed until March 21st to control the pandemic spread. Globally, the virus has claimed over 2.4 million lives and infected more than 110 million people so far. Details in the following report.
Ravaging cases, hindering curbs, political scandals, and extreme weather are affecting the nation's respective fights against the virus. Canada's largest city, Toronto, has extended the curbs until at least 8 March, despite schools only just starting up again. Argentina's health minister has resigned, following reports that people had been able to use connections to get access to vaccines to which they were not entitled. In the United States, about 6 million vaccines have been temporarily delayed due to the frigid weather. However, President Joe Biden expressed hope the vaccination drive in the U.S. can be concluded by July.
So we will have ordered much of which will have been distributed over 600 million doses by the end of July. July 29th is the expected date. That could change. Look what's happening with the weather now, for example. It's slowing up the distribution right now. But I believe we'll be approaching normalcy by the end of this year, and God willing, this Christmas will be different than last.
In Europe, Italy is investigating fake vaccines after regional officials received an offer to buy 27 million doses outside of the EU procurement system. Greece has extended lockdown restrictions to more areas of the country to stem the spread of the infection. The Dutch senators have approved a law underpinning the country's curfew until at least early March despite the court orders to lift curbs. Meanwhile, philanthropist Bill Gates said a politically sensitive gap between vaccinating people in wealthy and developing countries could narrow to half a year. Gates also urged the world for universal efforts against any future such crisis.
So the tools, the R&D side needs to be funded, and the field capacity, the factories, the surveillance, that team of 3,000. But these investments will have fantastic returns even when there's not a pandemic. And, I have very little doubt that, given what a tragedy this has been this time around, over the next 5 years, we'll get those things in place.
In Central Africa, 2 people have died as protests against new COVID-19 restrictions in Gabon degenerated into a standoff in 2 major cities.
In Pakistan, 36 people have died of COVID-19 and more than 1,300 tested positive for the virus overnight. The health ministry says the nationwide death toll has reached 12,563. It said nearly 570,000 people contracted the virus so far, out of which over 533,000 have recovered. The ministry said at present there are more than 24,000 active cases in Pakistan. It added over 2,000 patients are admitted in the hospitals across the country. An Indian court has extended the detention of climate activist Disha Ravi over a guide for anti-government farmers' protest. Ravi has been charged with sedition for creating protest toolkit. Ravi's arrest has raised concerns about a crackdown on dissent and prompted other climate activists to raise a voice. Swedish climate campaigner Greta Thunberg has tweeted her support for Ravi. Taking to Twitter, she wrote, "Freedom of speech are non-negotiable human rights." Meanwhile, another farmer has passed away during protests at Delhi border due to a heart attack. According to the Farmers Union, this has pushed the total number of farmer deaths to 208. The United Nations said Palestinian socio-economic development has suffered one of its worst years since 1994. Office of UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process said almost half of the Palestinian population requires humanitarian aid. In a report, it said the protracted humanitarian crisis in the country has been exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. The office described 2020 as a year of setbacks for Palestinians, their institutions and economy due to the pandemic. It said vaccines have begun arriving in the occupied Palestinian territory through the efforts of the WHO and UNICEF. And now it's time to take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. In Spain, protests over the jailing of a rapper for glorifying terrorism and insulting royalty have entered the 4th night. Protesters attacked 2 banks, smashing the window in Barcelona. Police have also charged protesters in the northern Catalan city of Girona. Earlier, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez condemned the violence. Pablo Hasél, known for his fiercely anti-establishment raps, has been sentenced to 9 months in prison. The incident has galvanized a debate over freedom of expression in Spain. The United States says it will delink a temporary pause on aid to Ethiopia from its policy on Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The dam has sparked a long-running dispute between Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan. Talking to reporters, State Department spokesperson Ned Price said Washington will review its policy on the dam. Price said the U.S. will assess the role it can play in facilitating a solution between the countries. He said resumption of aid will be based on a number of factors. The temporary pause on U.S. aid to Ethiopia affects $272 million in development and security assistance to the country. The UN says the scale of violence in South Sudan is a lot worse than during the country's 5-year civil war. In a report, the UN Human Rights Commission accused senior officials of supporting the armed groups. Commission's chairperson Yasmin Suka said violence is continuing in South Sudan. She said it is now localized and differs from the civil war, involving community leaders and militias. Suka said the attacks on civilians are being carried out along ethnic lines, often backed by armed state and opposition forces. Hundreds of people were killed last year alone, while millions are still struggling to recover from the civil war that ended in 2018. A group of 25 asylum seekers have entered the U.S. from a port of entry in San Ysidro, California. This marks the start of U.S. President Joe Biden's effort to unwind one of his predecessor's most restrictive immigration policies. The asylum seekers will now quarantine in a local hotel and wait for their cases to be heard in immigration courts. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security said the effort will expand in the coming week. Earlier on Thursday, the Democrats formally introduced Biden's sweeping immigration bill in Congress. The legislation will provide a path to citizenship for an estimated 11 million illegal immigrants in the U.S. U.S. President Joe Biden says he will approve a disaster declaration for storm-hit state of Texas, clearing the way for more aid. Speaking to the media, Biden said he will travel to Texas next week, a day after he approved a state of emergency. Power is returning to Texas in the wake of a major winter storm, but some 13 million residents are still facing difficulties accessing clean water. At least 30 people have died, and officials expect the number to rise. Officials say they are working to rapidly distribute bottled water and power generators to people in need. Several other southern states hit by snow and ice storms this week have also reported water service outages. The European Union says it is willing to join forces with the U.S. to counter challenges on climate change and digital market rules. The bloc's chief executive, Ursula von der Leyen, made the remarks at Munich's Security Conference. Leyen said a shared transatlantic commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 will make climate neutrality a new global benchmark. She termed the United States a natural partner for global leadership on climate change. The EU chief added, together Washington and Brussels can create a digital economy rulebook that is valid worldwide.
Today, I want to invite our American friends to join our initiatives. Together, we could create a digital economy rulebook that is valid worldwide. A set of rules based on our values: human rights and pluralism, inclusion, and the protection of privacy.
Earlier, the U.S. officially returned to the Paris Climate Accord with President Joe Biden, vying to make the fight against global warming a top priority. And now moving on, in Indonesia, 46 whales stranded on a beach on the island of Madura have died. The provincial governor says rescuers managed to push 3 whales back out to sea. The governor said authorities plan to bury the dead mammals once the tide recedes. Local officials said samples of the carcasses have been taken for an investigation into the cause of death. A non-governmental organization, Whale Stranding Indonesia, says in 2020, more than 70 mammals were found stranded. NASA's Mars Perseverance rover has sent the first ever colored images of the red planets. Scientists have shared 3 images which are showing the rover's descent, its wheel on the planet, and the surface of Mars. More about Red Planet in this report. The rover Perseverance is the most advanced astrobiology lab ever sent to another world. It has transmitted the first ever colored images of Mars. The high-resolution images provided by the rover have offered scientists a more detailed look at the Martian rocks, unlikely anything they have ever seen before. Perseverance Deputy Project Scientist Katie Stack-Morgan says that the big question for scientists is whether these are sedimentary or volcanic rocks. The information of the rocks on Mars' surface might open up new avenues of research on traces of ancient microbial life on the red planet.
Geologic time on Mars is still very relative, and that's something we'd like to really nail down. And so volcanic rocks are really great to get absolute age dates from. So if these are volcanic rocks, we are incredibly excited about that from a Mars sample return perspective, because we can really nail that age date with a sample from a volcanic rock.
Engineers report Perseverance to be in good health as they gradually commission its systems.
I'm happy to say that the rover is doing great and is healthy on the surface of Mars and continues to be highly functional and awesome, and I'm exhilarated.
The robotic vehicle sailed through space for nearly 7 months, covering 293 million miles before piercing the Martian atmosphere. In the United Kingdom, the Buckingham Palace says Prince Harry and his wife Meghan have made a final split with the British royal family. Harry and Meghan sent shockwaves through the monarchy last year by announcing they were splitting from the family. That split has now been formalized after discussions with Queen Elizabeth. Harry and Meghan will lose their royal patronages, which revert to the Queen and will be distributed among other family members. The couple moved with their son to Southern California to live a more independent life and escape the media. The famous US TV reality star Kim Kardashian has filed for divorce from her rapper husband Kanye West. The filing follows months of rumors that the relationship between the two celebrities was on the rocks. Details in the following report. Fashion mogul Kim Kardashian, who made her name from the reality TV series Keeping Up with the Kardashians, has officially parted ways with her husband Kanye West. Christy Welder, a representative for Kim, has confirmed the divorce filing. The couple had been married for almost 7 years and have 4 children together. Kim has asked for joint legal and physical custody of their children. The two, who married in a lavish wedding in Italy in 2014, have been living apart for some time. Their relationship became strained last year when Kanye West ran an unsuccessful campaign marked by statements to be elected as a U.S. president. The World Bank says it is working with the IMF on ways to factor climate change into talks to reduce debt burdens of poorer countries. World Bank President David Malpass says the creditors are studying how to twin global problems: the need to reduce or restructure the debt burden and the need to decrease fossil fuel emissions. Ethiopia, Chad, and Zambia have already initiated talks with creditors under a new common framework supported by the G20. In an interview, Malpass said he expects additional countries to request a restructuring of their debts. He said the poorer countries are not really emitting very much in terms of greenhouse gases, but added they're bearing the brunt of the impact from the rest of the world.
Revenues go down a lot. That's their tax.
Now it's time to have a look at the weather update across the globe. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.